into having a functional mushroom line or having trips or having other things that are related to the mushroom business or the psychedelic sector business that produce revenue today, not in 2 years from now or 3 years from now or whatever. They're working on it today. And eventually those companies that are working on revenue today always catch those other companies.
Welcome to the Daily Mushroom Podcast. That was the voice of Lenny Kerman, and Lenny is a strategic financial consultant that works with various cannabis and psychedelic psilocybin companies. So, if you are invested in the space or are planning to invest in the space, you're going to want to stick around and listen to this one right through to the end. Lots of golden nuggets in there from a true industry insider, and I hope you guys get a ton of value out of this one. I sure did. Enjoy.
Right. Lenny Kerman, thanks for joining us on the podcast today. It's great to have you here, man.
Thanks, bud. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. And so Lenny is, for our listeners here, Lenny is a partner, and he does business development for Rivet Advisory Group. That is a group that it does like financial consulting services for emerging alternative markets. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I'm sure, throughout today's podcast, we'll flesh it out a little bit more, but that's kind of the general gist of what we do.
Right.
My girlfriend still doesn't have a clue what I do for a living, so it's okay.
Right.
It's okay.
Yeah, good stuff. And then you've also worked with, and you're still working with, the Cannabis Manufacturers Guild, where you're also a partner and you do business development for them as well.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Right on. So let's get into that a little bit. Let's go back to the cannabis times.
Yeah.
I know you're still working in that. The market has shifted quite a bit from around legalization. I think was it October of 2018?
Yeah, that's correct.
When we hit legalization. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what? Tell us about some of the work that you've been doing with the cannabis companies.
Yeah, sure. Like what we do at CMG or Cannabis Manufacturers Guild, and again, just like you said, it's shifted, here and there throughout the last few years. But in general, we're a commercialization and business development service for cannabis companies. We founded it back in January of 2020. And the reason we founded it is because most of the business development departments and M&A departments for most of these cannabis companies were all laying off their staff. Right at the exact same time, they were taking down some of their first crops. So it was kind of this quagmire that most of these licensed producers were finding themselves in that they needed someone to help them get their stuff to marketplace because they had promised investors for years that they would eventually be in revenue. And right when they were about to be in revenue, they ran out of capital and they had to fire all their guys or girls. And so we were already starting to put out a lot of fires throughout various licensed producers. And we just said, why don't we just formalize it? And there's so many interesting, weird stories that led to that realization. That, the common joke within CMG is that when we write a book, we have no idea what we're going to title it. But last night we were joking around that maybe we'll just call it "What the F," and because it has just been such an insane few years that people would not believe it. But CMG in general is a commercialization agent. To get a little more granular on it, what the problem is with most cannabis companies is they have a lot of cannabis coming off the vine now, but they have no idea how to get that into a retail store and how to attract a consumer to that product. And what CMG does really well is firstly focuses on finding white spaces in the cannabis marketplace. So the example I can give you is that to launch a generic vaporizer or vape brand in the Canadian marketplace is truly insane at this very second, unless you had something that was really a differentiator associated with your brand. We try to find that white space where there's a little bit more room to play, less competition in certain marketplaces, and then we try to build a brand and build an identity to that brand so that it is something that consumers can also identify with. And then, of course, we work with various retailers as well as sales agencies to help place those products into the appropriate place. But we also have a good understanding of the regulatory side of things to work with the regulatory boards to get stuff approved. Because sands are constantly shifting in cannabis. I think that's the one constant that we're all really aware of. And that even happens on the regulatory side, in that the regulators who are approving what products get to marketplace versus what others don't get to marketplace, that's also shifting constantly. Like the Ontario cannabis store recently just put a pause on some of their product calls because they want to shift in how they actually accept those product calls. So people who are expecting to list something, let's say in the next couple of months, are not going to be able to do that until the product calls resume for Ontario. And that happens all the time right now because we're still a very new and infant industry. As a result, the regulators are doing their best. They're just figuring it out as they go sometimes, though.
Right, right. And were you working with any of these retail outlets before legalization when they were operating in that gray space?
No, no. I was pitched it all the time.
Right.
It was something that was constantly being offered, but it's one of those things that, as a finance guy, you can't even wrap your head around it because if you're going to go to your investor, you're now suggesting your investor to place capital into something that's going to potentially be in a legacy marketplace. That could be a problem. So it makes it very difficult to work on that side of the fence, because it's just, how are you going to create an ROI? How do you have trust that ROI? How does the business relationship work? There's too many unknowns to do something like that in the we'll call it the dispensary world.
Right. Yeah. I realize I put you on the spot there with
that's okay.
If you operated.
It's all good. Yeah.
And I think a better question would have been just like, like what you kind of laid out there, your perspective of the challenges in watching these companies operate and trying to be above board in an industry that you just couldn't at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. The cannabis industry is one of real interest, and the psychedelic industry, how it's kind of started, has been really similar, and a lot of the players involved are also the exact same players. So I think that's what's helped Rivet be successful in its first year of operation, is that we already knew all the guys, and we already knew all the companies, because many of them were just echoes or shadows of the cannabis companies that came before them 3-4 years ago. And much of the industry was, in essence, set up to have the same type of run that the cannabis companies had, which was that big increase in valuation. And then once legalization hit or something to that effect, then most of those people who rode that wave upwards were able to walk away from it. And that's always my growing concern within the psychedelic industry, is something like that happens. As legalization, or as more health organizations approve the use of psychedelics for the purpose of therapy, that many of those players who promoted stocks or really moved stock upwards were just there for that short window, not really there to operate a business. So
yeah, the old pump and dump.
Yeah,
just like
you said it.
Up
you
and...
said it.
Yeah, I watched a few of those go down. It can be a bit stomach churning to be an investor and see those things happen. So now we're seeing this as well, because I know there's at least 2 dispensaries, maybe 3 now, in Vancouver that are selling various psychedelics, mainly mushrooms. What's your perspective on that? And like these people, I mean, it's kind of just the same story of pre-legalization cannabis. They're doing the same things.
It's the same thing, just like you said. It's that from an investment perspective, it's a no touch. From a consulting perspective, like it's tough, because I also have, I'm not going to say I'm an advocate for the industry, but I really see a lot of value in both industries personally. To give you some background on myself, like I know we've spoken a bunch of times, Brett, in the past. Yeah. I personally have a liver disease called primary sclerosing cholangitis, which is like this genetic rare disease that in essence my liver is fighting itself all the time. But what I was doing a couple of years ago is I was using cannabis to help me sleep at night, because I'm not a good sleeper. And I was doing cordyceps in the morning, which is, of course, a functional mushroom, to help me build up my energy and, heal myself. And when I went back to the doctors just for a checkup to see how my liver is doing, they had said that actually my liver had improved to a certain degree. One, because I'm probably sleeping more effectively, but two, I also have the appropriate nutrients in my body. So I'm a big believer in that from the efficacy side of functional mushroom as well as cannabis. But even on the psychedelic side, I'm a believer in many of the claims that have been coming out of some of these scientific studies, suggesting that psilocybin or various other psychedelics are great for assisting some kind of therapeutical use, whether it be PTSD or trauma, or just in general making free associations to what you're dealing with in your lifetime. So for me to balance those two things, where I got the finance side, where it's like, you can't really touch that. We got to operate within the regulatory regime. Yet on the other side, you have this advocacy where you do really believe in this. It's tough for me because I don't see psychedelic mushrooms as a viable recreational drug today or in the near future.
Not even on the microdosing side?
Again, I would love it, but I think if you're going to open up microdosing, the regulatory side of things is going to say, well, it's open. If you say yes to one thing, then you have to say yes to all of it. But I do think that there is a sizable opportunity on the medical side and the pharmaceutical side. And where that goes, it's very hard to tell you, with a crystal ball as to where I see that happening. But I think it's going to be a hard grind, specifically in Canada. I can't speak to the States because it's a much more state level, regulatory regime.
Right.
But in Canada, they may decriminalize, and I look forward to that day. But I think it's going to take a little while to get on the recreational side for the mushroom side of things. I think that there's a lot of people lobbying it right now. But the problem is that, of course, mushrooms are a much stronger compound than cannabis from the actual psychoactive effects that take place. But also, there's such a large opportunity in the medical side. Cannabis came with medical first and then recreational second. And I don't even think we did it right. I think we just did it. But I think that on the psilocybin sector, the first thing you're going to see is on the medical side, it will be approved for proper treatment, and there'll be treatment protocols. It won't be necessarily a mushroom. Maybe, like you said, it's a microdosing pill to do some trials and enter some clinical trials. So it's going to be a long way, I think, before we see it. And when I say a long way, it could be 2-3 years, because 2-3 years in cannabis or psilocybin is an eon. But in regular business, that's really fast for people to write regs on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree. Especially when you're watching the markets and watching the sector on a daily basis.
Yeah.
It can really feel like why isn't this happening yet? Like what's going on? Like, why can't we just speed this up? But I agree that it could be a bit of a slow crawl here.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about some of these psychedelic companies that you've been looking at. You can't speak to any that you're working with. That's totally fine. But what's justifying some of these valuations that we're seeing? There's no revenue. We got MindMed is at like 1.1 billion, Compass 1.3 billion.
Yeah.
How are we maybe as investors? Investing in a gray market. How are we to make sense of this?
The pump is there, buddy. I could speak to it, like from, again, an anecdotal story, because until, let's call it March of this year, I had no idea about the psilocybin sector as the point of view of investment. I was watching it from the standpoint of, psychedelics and getting, involved in certain things because I'm friendly with the guys over at SciTech. I was friendly with the guys at ICANN prior to SciTech. So I do know some of those players that were in the industry, and I was just following it just as someone who takes an interest. But in March is when I started to work with Rivet, and one of the functions that I was going to take down with Rivet was to handle the psilocybin files. That was going to be my thing. So being the type A personality professionally that I am, I just did a super deep dive for about a 2-month period, where recognizing that if I was going to do any type of M&A work in the sector, I needed to speak to a lot of people, needed to understand what they're doing and what's happening out there. And what I found is, On the private sector, I could speak differently from the public sector, because the public sector is again, there's too many factors and too many variables to really consider as to why a specific stock is that price point. I could talk about it to a certain level, but on the private sector, what I was finding, and I'm still finding it today, it's not like anything has changed whatsoever, is that if you have a relatively good team and
Yep.
and the intent of creating a novel molecule or some kind of IP surrounding a potentiality for a drug compound,
Yeah.
your valuation is $10 million. Full stop. For whatever reason, just that's the way it is. It's $8 to $10 million. I've seen some at 7. I've seen some at 9. I've seen some at 10. I've seen some at 11, but I haven't seen any at 1. I haven't seen any at 2. I haven't seen any at 3. I haven't seen any at 4. And it's alarming because they've got nothing. A lot of these companies, they've got a good team. They're really nice people, and they're smart. They're super smart, and they've got great resumes. But if you've done anything in pharma, you know how much money it costs to take a drug all the way to fruition. We're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars to go from creating a novel molecule to doing some clinical trials to getting it approved by an FDA or other regulatory regime as it relates to pharmaceuticals. Then once you have that, all of those puzzle pieces together, you need to build a supply chain. And then once you build a supply chain, then you need to build a sales organization too. And the sales organization needs to be robust. These pharma sales agents don't make, $10,000 a year. They're making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year because they're very skilled people. And in order to get a drug properly placed into a doctor's hands so that they're going to prescribe said medicine, it ain't easy. So these companies who are raising money, there's hundreds of them. Literally hundreds of psilocybin sector or ketamine or 5-MeO DMT companies. They're all trying to raise capital to create this novel molecule, do these clinical trials, and do all this work. Whereas the sophisticated and educated and somewhat pessimistic investor looks at those things and says, okay, that's great. And I think that you probably will be able to create that novel molecule and maybe even be able to get that patented. But in reality, to get that into clinical trials, you need another $25 million. To do this, you need another, $50 million. You need another couple hundred. So you have to have the confidence in the team that they'll not only be able to operate the business today, but they'll be able to raise significant capital to the point where they're going to be able to get their product to the finish line. Otherwise, it is just a pump and dump M&A capital markets play, where the hope is eventually once this patent happens, then you're just going to sell the patent to someone else. And that's the entire business model, which is not what's being represented in many of these pitches that I've sat in on. So speaking to the private side, that's on the private side. On the public sector, investors are only interested in pharmaceutical, which is akin to in cannabis. When I was pre-legalization, if you walk into any banker's office, any of the big banks, the Canacords of the world, the Gravitas of the world, any of those guys, and you started talking about a cannabis project that included some level of cultivation, the first question that any one of the bankers was asking was, what is your canopy space so that I can calculate what your revenue is going to be when you're there? And if there's been anything that we've learned, we even knew it back then, anything that we've learned is that is not relevant as it relates to revenue whatsoever. Your canopy space is not even associated with your revenue numbers.
And by canopy space, you mean actual like warehouse grow space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was what every banker was talking about all the time. What is your canopy space? Because they would say, okay, you got 10 plants, so then if your 10 plants sell and yield X many grams, and your grams are going to cost this much to the end consumer, now we can figure out what your pro forma revenue is going to be. That's assuming that all your products are going to be flour.
Yep.
And the consumption of flour is just going to be enormous, and everyone's just going to buy and buy and buy and buy.
Right.
Number one, cannabis does not grow in enormous 100,000 square foot indoor facilities well. Typically, cannabis grows in much smaller rooms. mushrooms. If you're going to do something proper with good craft cultivation, you're looking at 2,000 square feet is kind of the max room that you want to be in so that you can maintain a proper ecosystem in that little room. That was the first thing. But psilocybin is kind of the very similar sector, which is saying, what novel molecule you're going to create, what pharma thing are you trying to prove? Okay, I'm going to give you this big valuation based upon that thing.
Right.
Irrelevant to revenue, because there are some companies that are out there right now, I won't mention them again for the purpose of today's conversation, that are already in revenue because they didn't just focus 100% of their attention on this unicorn idea of I'm going to be a pharmaceutical company that's going to be enormous. They diversified their portfolio into having a functional mushroom line or having trips or having other things that are related to the mushroom business or the psychedelic sector business that produce revenue today, not in 2 years from now or 3 years from now or whatever. Right. They're working on it today. And eventually those companies that are working on revenue today always catch those other companies, whether it be by way of merger or acquisition, or it be by way of they're the ones who are still alive at the end of the day. All those things always catch up to people, and it will be the same thing with psilocybin, or it will be the same thing with ketamine, same thing with 5-MeO. Companies are focusing wholly their attention on this pharma unicorn, and I think to their own detriment. But investors are following suit too, though, and
of course they are. Yeah,
it is what it is.
Well, I mean, when you see some of these valuations, that's not just that's investors that have pumped that up largely as well, right? So
for sure.
Have taken the bait on them. So, so you that's a lot, man. That's good info. No, and I love it. This is why we're here. You just blew my mind. I'm trying not to think too much about some of the companies that I'm invested in and being like, what's their revenue doing?
Good size.
But so that revenue piece is huge though, and because those companies that are focusing on revenue now, they have the entire like equation figured out, right?
Yeah.
You talk there's can be companies that are really good at growing or X, Y, Z, but until you have that revenue piece, what do you really have, right?
Yeah, you're dead. And to take a stab at certain things, you look at the Hexo acquisition of Redecan, which happened relatively recently. They've been working through some of the kinks there. But Redecan was a privately held cannabis company producing massive amounts of revenue. They've got a good pre-roll line. They've got a brand in marketplace that has weight, has acceptance, and has a really interesting format to it. Hexo recognizes that, and Hexo is the exact opposite. Hexo's brands, to the most part, are wishy-washy. Most people don't recognize them offhand. They're no one knows what lane that they're in, but they're huge, so they have the ability to make an acquisition such as this one. So it's akin to what I was just saying, is that the revenue companies are the ones who survive, because there's so many other companies on the other side of the coin in cannabis that didn't have that big pump and didn't get to revenue. And they're all in CCAA, or they're all in CIS process. They're all practically bankrupt. And that's actually part and parcel of like how we all started CMG, was some of those conversations with some of those bankrupt LPs or about to be bankrupt LPs looking for a lifeline or looking for a solution. And I'm worried that the psychedelic sector will echo the exact same arc, in that a lot of those psilocybin companies or a lot of those ketamine companies are going to struggle in, let's call it 9 months to 14 months, when it comes time that there's just no cash. There hasn't been any cash. They've done all the runway thing. They're going to need to raise more capital. And if the investor sentiment has changed one iota, they're going to be SOL. And I'm trying to convey that to any of these psilocybin companies or any of these ketamine companies I've been speaking to, is don't just make your business about raising money. If you do, you're going to go the same way that a lot of the cannabis companies did.
Right. Yeah, it's got to be about that branding and that market positioning with their like product market fit positioning, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. And without that, you're in deep trouble. So there's kind of like there'd be, I guess, like three different types of positionings that some of these different psychedelic companies have. There might be more, but there's clinical, right? So that we're seeing companies like Field Trip is setting up these ketamine clinics across Canada and some in the U.S. as well. And then there's the cultivation side, right? So you've got like companies that are just focusing on growing. And I guess like, clinical and retail therapy are kind of the same there, right? So let's speak to a little bit of what those companies that are working in the clinical therapy side. Is that what you see as kind of the most important route? Because you've mentioned before that the recreational side is going to be very challenging with psychedelics?
Well, I think recreational in Canada is going to be very challenging. There's going to be other jurisdictions where it's going to be a little more open, a little bit more welcoming. And when I say recreational, I'm still not saying that, hey, let's go do shrooms and let's sit around a campfire and hang out. You know, those were good university days. But I'm more so referring to like some of these trips where they're doing, not necessarily clinical trips, but they're talking about recreational trips where people go on a couples trip and they do some therapy, they do some yoga, they do some healing, and then they do some psychedelics. I love those type of companies, not because the revenue is so juicy and so amazing. It's again balancing the business side with the advocacy side. That part of the marketplace is growing aggressively, just from guys like you and me and typical people who want to go on a trip like this, and they're terrified to do a psychedelic on their own. Most people, I would suggest, probably like 98 to 99% of people don't want to do a psychedelic trip on their own. No way. So these recreational trips where you can go down to Jamaica or you can go to Costa Rica or you can go to Mexico or any of those things, they're gaining massive momentum, massive. And the investors haven't really picked up on that in the sense of, hey, throwing down dollars, because the revenue is not enormous. It's not like you're going to be a billion-dollar company doing these trips unless you're doing them consistently. But I see massive value in those, not only for the fact that they are really good for people, but two, it's a really predictable revenue stream. If you're going to do a trip, it's going to be a premium experience, so you're going to be able to charge a premium price point. You know what your costs are going to be in those jurisdictions. And furthermore, if you collect the data in a very predictable manner and a very succinct manner, and you work with those who are in clinical trials, this can sometimes act as preclinical trial data, giving them indications of some of the things they're going to be doing. So the fact that people have not spent their money on this stuff yet as investors is shocking to me. It's crazy.
Wow.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
The second side of things is the foot in the door methodology. I really believe in the foot in the door methodology in that, let's say you know nothing about mushrooms whatsoever. You've certainly heard about reishi or chaga or something like ashwagandha, turkey tail. Like you've heard of one of them. Maybe not all of them, but maybe one of them. And you've heard about the health benefits associated with them. So if one were to be able to build a brand that has large major market adoption, focusing on functional mushrooms, eventually the revenue associated with that is going to be juicy enough for investors, again, to also be attracted to it. Forgetting about the psychedelic stuff, forget about that just for a second, is that brand weight carries with it value. Look at Four Sigmatic, look at Mudwater, look at, what's it called, Host Defense with Paul Stamets, right? Like, these companies are good companies. They're every single month in, month out, they're producing $2-3 million worth of revenue just in their functional mushroom line at a margin of 30-40%. Why the F wouldn't people want to invest in a business like that one is beyond me, just beyond me. And then lastly, I think the clinical relationship is of use today. But the problem I have with that is these ketamine clinics and what have you, the SOPs need to be standardized in a large fashion.
SOP?
So standard operating procedure, sorry.
Okay.
So the standard operating procedures of each one of these clinics cannot be subject to any artistic flair. If it's a ketamine clinic, and that is a legal thing to do in a certain jurisdiction, then all ketamine clinics within that jurisdiction must follow a certain set of standard operating procedures, in my eyes. So if they don't, what is the real data that they're taking down?
Right.
What is the real efficacy in the long run? Is it something that's going to be peer accepted globally? So a lot of these companies are doing a great job, and I'm not necessarily here to crap on any of those companies. I'm not, because I actually do see value in that avenue of work. What I am stating, though, is that I would like those businesses more if they had a statewide regulatory board that said, even if it's a self-regulated organization like an SRO, I'm happy with that, where they form their own self-regulatory organization with their competitors. And they all come together and say, here's what the standard operating procedures are going to be for this clinic to ensure that we cover off all of our bases, as well as our patients know that when they come to us, there's a certain level of confidence. Because we're a new industry, we need to build that confidence and create that acceptance worldwide. And we're only going to do that if we create some SROs. Yeah. So it's one of the things that has been on my mind a lot recently, is that those companies who are willing to step into a self-regulatory organization format are the ones I'm interested in long term.
Right on. That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, I can't agree more with your point there too. How do we quantify something if there's no baseline that we can all agree upon, that like this is what we're doing here, right? Yeah. Otherwise, it's just kind of chaos, and I'm concerned too that we could see, if we're a little bit too like loosey-goosey with psychedelics and what we're doing, that we could see what happened. Exactly what happened, 50 years ago, and then I believe in the 90s there was like they were kind of getting close, and then it, we had another big setback. So I'm really hoping we don't see that again.
Yeah, and the only way to skirt stuff like that is to get out of the shadows and regulate ourselves. And I think that most companies in today's marketplace just need someone to say that and do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the next evolution of what's going to happen within the overall industry.
Right. And so the Cannabis Manufacturers Guild, is that kind of is that like self-regulatory part of it? Is that kind of baked in, so like companies could come to an organization like yourselves and be like, let's all get together and agree on something? Did you guys work on that?
We could. It's not something that we've ever walked down that path, because the thing with cannabis in general, for CMG side of things, is that it is a recreational side of things. It's like wine. Like in my opinion, cannabis, especially in Canada, is much more like wine than it is like a medicine in today's marketplace. Because we're talking about craft cannabis. That sounds like a wine. That sounds like beer. We're talking about how this affects you and how that affects you, but really we're also looking for like cool products and cool brands. You're not like going to Pfizer and being like, yo, like you're Ambien, let's pump that up, So, but I think that the psilocybin sector and the psychedelic sector is much more akin to pharma and medicine. So it really does require that SRO more than the cannabis sector does. The cannabis sector, though, needs one thing, which is a no asshole policy.
Yes.
Okay,
we talked about this earlier. I love this.
Shit.
Go ahead.
We gotta get. Sorry, I dropped my first swear
That's
there.
All
Sorry,
right.
dude. It is.
It's allowed.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. The cannabis sector, when it started pre-legalization, was filled with what I would call legacy guys who wanted to do good business, wanted to get out of that world, and wanted to find a home. And it was no asshole. It was a lot of sharing, a lot of collaboration, a lot of, hey, let's scratch your back, I'll scratch my back. Let's figure these things out together. Right. Since that time, the asshole quota has gone up significantly in cannabis, and I can say it honestly because it's a lot of the bankers, a lot of business guys walked in there with their large egos and their perspective on things, and took over how they wanted to run it. And that's part and parcel why many of the cannabis companies are all about this canopy space that I was talking about earlier. It was bankers. if you go to any grower, they'll tell you right away. They're like, "That's an insane way to run a business." All the growers were saying that you can't grow cannabis that way. That's insane. That's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, like your pro forma is ridiculous.
Right. But then the guys with their spreadsheets and their formulas roll in, and they, most of them probably have never even smoked pot.
Exactly. They haven't smoked pot. They don't know what pot is. They don't know what the market
culture.
is. They're crazy. And it's been like a pendulum back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because the bankers and the business guys do have a big use. The big use is that they recognize you got to run this like a business.
Yeah.
That, even though the cultivation is more an art, and so is extraction is more of an art. It's an art form, and I really do believe that. But running the business is a business. And that means it needs to run like a business. It needs to be managed like a business. It needs to go like a business. So, after the bankers got out, after the big pump and dump, all the cannabis guys came back in, and the cannabis guys started to get back into this, craft idea and cultivating things so appropriately. And then, of course, bankruptcies started to go up, and they're left with a bag of this huge debt load or these huge, investor issues that the bankers left, and these cannabis guys were like, well, I don't know what to do. And now the bankers are back in, and the cannabis guys are all working together, and it's a struggle. It's a back and forth struggle. The initial cannabis guys don't trust the bankers, potentially rightfully so, maybe not rightfully so, and the bankers don't trust the cannabis guys, maybe rightfully so, maybe not rightfully so. So it's just that what I would love to see is the return of the days where it's about collaboration and building an industry.
Do you feel that? Do you feel that's the way that things are happening right now in the psychedelic space, or are the assholes here as well?
Oh, the assholes are very here because it's all cannabis guys. It's all the banker cannabis guys. It's all the It's totally it's all that and then some, because the people who didn't participate in cannabis because they missed out on it, they're all here for psychedelics. But on the psychedelic side of things, what I found though is that some of the bankers have certainly mellowed out on the psychedelic side. They realize the folly of their ways as it relates to the cannabis sector, in that they were just overzealous. And with the psychedelic sector, I have found that some of the bankers that I have spoken to are almost Zen-like. They're not here for that pump and dump the same way that they were before. Again, like there's a lot of guys here for the pump and dump, absolutely on the psychedelic sector. But I found a lot of bankers here that I've spoken to and developed some personal relationship with. They're here for the long haul. They're not here to get out. They're here to run a business. They are going to focus on a business. They want to do something good. I still believe that their valuations are insane, but they actually want to do something with the business. That's the only difference right now.
That's very, very refreshing to hear. Sounds like they might be doing psychedelics.
It's quite possible.
Got that ego in check a little bit.
There you go. They made that free association. There you go.
Yeah. Oh man, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
So you mentioned. Have you been on any of these trips down to Jamaica or Mexico? Are you willing to talk about that?
I'm willing to talk about it.
Because technically it's legal there, right?
It's a total easy answer. I haven't.
Okay.
But I will say I'm really interested in it.
Yes,
I really want to.
Me too.
But like straight up, I'm 41 years old. I've got a daughter who's almost 10. I've got a stepdaughter who's almost 13. I've got a girlfriend. I just lost my mom. I've got responsibilities like up to here. So the thought of going down to do a trip like that just for me is a real tough thing. It's tough. Yeah. It's tough. But do I want to? Abso-freaking-lutely. I haven't done mushrooms since I was 20 years old. Okay. I remember the experience well. Not because I learned so much from it or I had some kind of epiphany. It wasn't in therapy. I was at a party. But I am a very strong believer, based on the scientific data that has been coming out of the psychedelic world, that I could benefit from that enormously. Right. Enormously.
It could potentially improve your relationship to
100%.
Your kids and your wife. Yeah.
100%. I'm a massive believer in that. Also, I think that we live in a society like COVID is a good example. Like we live in a society that is pretty much like rote. We're just doing the
Right.
same crap over and over and over and over again, and our brains become completely dependent on those pathways.
Uh-huh.
And the entire nature of psychedelics is that you actually form new pathways and you branch out. And what is that going to look like? Wouldn't that be interesting?
Mm-hmm.
If someone said to me, "Hey, you're going to grow new neural pathways in a 4-day, 5-day experience," I would look at them like, "Yes, I'm in
Yeah.
100%." Because I'm a big believer in human development and growth potential and all those things. If you told me that 10 years ago, I would have been, yes, I will go to that Tony Robbins trip. I will go do
Right.
that. I will
Yep.
be there. I will go see Bob Proctor. I will go see, Robin Sharma. I'll go see
Mm-hmm.
those guys because I will learn something and increase the neural pathway. Here, we're
Right.
actually saying scientifically it happens.
Yeah.
Shit, that's cool. That's
I know.
really, really cool.
It's amazing to see these studies coming out, and you're like, holy shit,
Yeah.
this is real.
And that's the difference between cannabis and this, is
Yeah.
that I love cannabis. I
Mm-hmm.
love cannabis. But the
Sometimes you get
scientific,
high, and then you think back, and you're like, what was I?
what did I was
What were those
thinking?
epiphanies I had
I
last
had a
night?
good idea for a movie, didn't I? But I think with the psychedelic side of things, the scientific data is there already, and
Right.
we've barely studied the stuff.
I know. Yeah.
It's crazy. So
Yeah.
what will happen in 5 years from now if the U.S. government or the Canadian government actually say, "Okay, go study this in a big way"?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I feel that we're on a groundbreaking road right here. I
Mm-hmm.
remember when the iPhone came out. I do remember, and I
Yeah.
remember recognizing right away that this was a big deal. This was
Mm.
even though the BlackBerry was there, I recognized the iPhone. This is a big effing deal, and
Yeah.
I think psychedelics is that same big effing deal, much like electric cars are right now. Is that
Mm.
we're stepping into a new age of understanding of our brains, and I think that this is probably one of the first steps we're going to take.
Amazing. Yeah, and that was uh, the thought of that was like what Dennis Leary was all about too, right? When he was working on this stuff back in the '60s, was how do we get the people at the top that are in power and in control to start to have some of these mind expanding experiences, and then what would that do to the world? How would that change the course of things? Fortunately, he kind of went a little bit off the rails and started maybe manipulating some data, and things got a little crazy. But
I've certainly seen that in these sectors. A little bit
yeah, yeah.
of
Well, there's also, there's all the talk about ego death or ego deflation in using psychedelics, but then there's also ego inflation, right?
and
Where people
paranoia.
think like, yeah, paranoia, but also people can think that this is an opportunity to use some of these substances to not liberate people, but to control them further. So
Yes,
a
yes.
fine balance that we're tiptoeing there.
U.S. government LSD. Oh wow, we're
Yeah,
going down
yeah.
that path. Shit.
Oh, I know. Yeah, if anybody wants to look into what was going on, what was the name of that MK Ultra?
Yeah, there you
That's
go.
that's a fascinating rabbit hole for anyone to dive down.
I had to teach my kids about that after watching that movie Red.
Red, I haven't seen that one.
It's a funny movie, but John Malkovich is in it, and
Okay.
was a subject in MK Ultra.
Oh, damn.
So he's a little
Okay,
bit off. A little bit off.
I'm definitely gonna watch that. That sounds right up my alley.
Yeah.
Right on. So, okay. What else? What else can you tell us, Lenny?
There's so
this
much.
has been super
so-
informational, man.
Yeah, well, it's just I think if anyone's listening to a podcast like this one, for the purpose of kind of educating oneself, for the purpose of investment or things like that, my comment is you have to immerse yourself.
Yeah.
Podcasts will do you good, but many of the CEOs of these companies are raising capital, so they're all willing to take phone calls, and you can speak to all of them, and you'll be able to evaluate. Number one, that good asshole check, like I was saying earlier, is that if the guy's an asshole, just don't invest with him. You just don't need it. There's other investments out there. You're not missing the silver bullet with one company. If you are, then I'm really sorry for you. I'm really sorry that I messed you up.
Keep that FOMO in check.
Yeah, but I think that for anyone looking to get into these industries, being so new as they are, we all have to recognize that a lot of stuff's going to happen still. And it's going to happen fast and furious. And small things may turn into big things, and big things may turn into completely useless things. The example I can give you is that, you may think that the U.S. is going to legalize cannabis in 2 seconds, and it may actually be a small thing because it may not have any material effect on the marketplace because of other things. Maybe it's the Banking Act. Maybe it's the Safe Banking Act was supposed to come out, and everyone thought the Safe Banking Act was going to do that for cannabis. It's supposed to be huge, but it ended up not being that big of a deal because most
Right.
banks are still not willing to touch it. What I suggest to people is the industry is at the forefront. We're at the bleeding
Yeah.
edge of what's happening within the brain. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best investment. It could be a good investment. I'm not going to suggest that it's the best, though, because there are other investments as well. It's a growth industry. It needs to be looked at as a growth industry where there's going to be a ton of volatility. There's going to be a lot of unknowns happening. And the company that you're investing into that sounds amazing today could be bankrupt in 6 months because maybe they have bad management, or maybe they hire the wrong people, or they go in the wrong direction, or regulatory changes happen. 100 things could happen. To your earlier comment about like the compass and the pathways and the field trips, those guys are going to be the guys who are going to be able to take something to fruition. They
Right.
have the money now, they have the market cap. They're the ones who are going to have the pharmaceutical advantage over many other companies. And it doesn't mean that other companies are not going to succeed. It just means that they may get gobbled up by a compass, a pathway, a field trip, much like Canopy bought all those
Yep.
companies, much like Hexo did the same thing, much like Aurora did the same thing. Those big companies are now in a position where they're big enough that they're going to be able to acquire a lot of the smaller players if they show any type of viability. And they'll be
Right.
able to sit back and pick and choose as to which ones survive and which ones die. So if you're looking to invest in the sector, my strong suggestion is make the phone calls. Reach out to the CEOs of the IR departments. Many of them will take your calls. Many of them have the time to speak to you right now because they're looking for money.
Yeah.
And that puts you in the driver's seat as an investor. And from the cannabis companies or the psychedelic companies that are listening to me and hear this, this know-it-all guy from Toronto speaking, I I'm more so saying I love the industries that I'm in, but
Yeah.
I want them to do better. I want them to
Yeah.
run a business. We're not
Yeah.
here to just pump. We're here to run a business. We're here to do good things. And if you have a team that wants to run the business, all the investors should get behind that. It's not about the stock price, reflect versus Monday versus Wednesday. Even though I'm an
Right.
advisor and I do work in that capacity, and that my job is to help advise the company on making sure that they look good on the capital market stage, and I do that hopefully very effectively. I also want to make sure that any company that I'm working with is a business and
Right.
that they're running a business. They're focusing on revenue today. They're not just focusing on revenue 5 years from now. Because how are you going to get to 5 years if you don't have revenue today? You're just going to keep
Yeah.
on raising money and diluting your first investors and your second investors and your third investors. So,
And eventually the
so,
bubble
so,
will
so,
burst. Yeah.
so, the war stories I could tell you, some of them are related to business, some of them are less, related to the capital market side of things.
Right.
But my take on the industries as a whole is that cannabis is going to be more like wine. That's the lane it's finding itself in,
Mm-hmm.
and the psychedelic sector is going to be more like pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I'm actually seeing it a little bit right now with these different strains of mushrooms that are coming out, which is is reminding me of all the various. You walk into a pot shop now, and it's just like an overwhelming selection of crazy names that someone's like. I don't want to smoke Gorilla Glue, that doesn't sound like a good time to me.
That's the funny
And
thing is like, okay, so my girlfriend doesn't smoke at all,
right.
and I had some black garlic. Okay, and she
But
goes,
why would you want to smoke
she's
that?
like, who the fuck wants to smoke black garlic? Like, what is that? That's not like, does it taste like garlic and you're smoking garlic? That's an awful idea. It's like,
Right.
no, no, no.
Yeah, I know. And there's one that came out. I saw it recently. Great white shark is a type of mushroom, and I was like, that's like, I don't want a great white shark entering my psychedelic experience. It sounds like a bad time.
That's a
That's
bad
not where I
trip.
want to be.
That's,
Yeah. What are we trying to do here?
yeah.
So it just seemed like a bit of a disconnect there. But hey, that's marketers that are trying to capitalize and
Yeah.
craft their certain products, right? So
Yeah.
hats off to them, and I guess have fun out there with all that. But
Yeah, and also like as a word of caution, like it leads me to like a quick little story here, but
mm,
word of caution is the industry is new,
yeah,
meaning that there's going to be some weird stuff that's going to happen. So it takes me back like to so at the beginning of COVID, um, we're all trying to figure out our stuff. Like
right,
CMG is trying to figure out our stuff. We're not fully formed yet. We're all trying to make money because we're all getting shut down now, locked down. We don't know where next paycheck is going to go. So me and my partners are trying to broker some deals, and we're trying to partner up LP1 with LP2, who's got a buy order, and hopefully get some compensation in the middle of these things. So in doing so, you start to meet some interesting people. By the way, like 90% of the people at the beginning of this COVID world were all trying to do PPE. So even though they were in cannabis somehow, all of a sudden they were all in PPE, selling
what's PP,
masks.
PPE?
Yeah,
Oh, personal
selling
protective equipment.
masks and
Yeah,
selling
yeah, yeah.
gloves. Like somehow all of a sudden every cannabis guy who was working in the cannabis industry was selling PPE. That should have
Right.
been my alarm bell.
Yeah, no kidding.
The brokers I was dealing with were half in, half out.
Yeah.
So we at CMG at that time were starting to talk about maybe formulating something where we're going to be a business development service. But in the meantime, we hadn't done that yet. We were just speaking to brokers who said, "Hey, I've got this buy order, that buy order," and we were learning on the fly. And this is akin. It's like a warning to investors that are out there.
Right.
So a broker came to me and said he needed 1,000 kilograms of THC isolate. And if anyone does the quick math, that's an enormous amount of THC isolate. So
Right.
we're saying, wow, this is a
Yeah, like
great order. Sorry,
how much actual weed would you need to produce that much isolate?
tons. Like we're
Yeah.
talking an enormous amount of weed.
Right. Yeah.
Also, the end consumer usage of isolate would also have to be enormous.
Yeah. Huge market. Right. 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 Yeah.
Exactly. So like the entire market of Canada practically is 1,000 kilograms of isolate
What?
per month.
Right.
Okay, so we immediately like put up the alarm bells here, and we start fishing now.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure this order out, and of course the first questions that we start asking are the typical question: Have you verified the buyer? Okay, have you verified this person who wants to purchase this isolate?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I've verified the buyer multiple times. Okay, does the buyer show you proof of funds? Yes, yeah, absolutely. Um, so we go down the path and we do a quick little analogy, just like what you just did, which is what is the input? Because
Right.
at that very moment, which is like, let's call it late 2019, early 2020, most cannabis, uh, companies are not producing isolate. It's not an easy process. It's expensive as
Right.
hell.
Right. Yeah.
So we're like, what if we did it ourselves? What if we, partnered with a licensed producer that we're friendly with, that we already are working with in some way, shape, or form, and we get them to take down the order? We found it. We baked the whole deal completely, and we started going back to the buyer, and we say, okay, we need to verify your buy orders. You know, that initial verified buy order starts to diminish in quality as we go down the layers. Oh no, it's actually a
Right.
few different buy orders. It's
Right.
this buy order is this buy order is this, and I got 5 or 6 of these. Okay, great, awesome, fantastic, great stuff.
Yeah.
Who's the buyer? It's a pharmaceutical company that's making the big order. Okay, sure. What it ended up being was that this broker had received a single buy order of 100 kilograms a month for 12 months. And he
Okay.
put out this buy order to a bunch of other brokers to purchase this isolate.
Mm-hmm.
And the bouncing begins, and this little daisy chains begins, and it gets back to the initial broker. And the initial broker says, "Oh, really? You have a buy order as well?"
Right.
So now he goes, and he said, "I got a 200 kilogram buy order," and puts it back into his echo chamber.
Mm.
And he did that 3 or 4 times without realizing that his 100 kilogram buy order had ballooned to a 1,000 kilogram buy order because of his ineptitude.
Ugh.
So when we finally addressed that with him and said, we spoke to some of your brokers, and it turns out that it's actually your order on both sides of the equation. We were able to do the
Ugh.
math.
Wow.
So it's a tale of caution
Yep.
that one has to really do their due diligence
Right.
as it relates to the companies that they're investing into, and they have to, whether it be psychedelics or cannabis, is you
Hmm.
can't just take someone's word for something that they're good for it.
Right.
It's especially with such a new industry. There's a lot of people who don't even know that they don't know. They're
Hmm.
just too green, too new. So what we at the Cannabis Manufacturers Guild and Rivet do is we provide a steady hand.
Hmm.
That's kind of the way I try to describe it to people. Is what we do is we're the steady hand of each industry. Is we're not here to pump your stock up, $20, $30 or something ridiculous like we've seen in the past. That's not what we do. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to provide you potentially interesting M&A transactions, some advisory work as it relates to your IR strategy, maybe even some advisory work as it relates to your investment banker strategy. Maybe you're with the wrong guy who's not giving you the attention that you need to have.
Hmm.
Maybe we'll walk into your social media side of the business and say, you're missing the boat on your narrative. Your narrative is a little bit muddled.
Hmm.
Um, when that starts to happen and the narratives become a lot more clear, that's when the company starts. It's not the company. The industry becomes more mature. It's just how these things work. Is that in the initial onset, everyone's doing the same thing. They are just facsimiles of each other.
Hmm.
But as the companies gain certain maturity, they start to understand who they are. It's just like us as teenagers. When you're a
Right.
teenager, you have no clue who you are. You're just a facsimile of each other. I'm in the grunge group.
Exactly.
We're all grunge. We're all wearing the same clothes of grunge. We're all doing the same thing.
Yep.
As you get older, you start to figure out who you are. Same thing
Hmm.
with these businesses. Is
Hmm.
that as the narrative is really clear, that means that the company has a real understanding of its own identity.
Right.
And it's a hard thing to peg quickly, but
Hmm.
it's something that you start to figure out quite quickly. And then you can dig into the financials, you can do your own due diligence and all the other shit that people do.
Right.
But identity is a big thing in these industries. And if you don't have a clear identity, you're nobody.
Right. Yeah. So, what about for people who maybe don't have the time or interest but want to get involved investing in this space? I see Horizons uh, have like put out their ETF in the last
Mm,
12 months.
yep.
What's your opinion on that kind of financial strategy for someone?
It's a strategy, but it should be a diminutive part of your overall strategy to invest.
Right.
The last year has been a little bit alarming for me as an investor, as someone who has watched the markets a lot. And that's the Wall Street Bets crowd. Is that
Right.
they're
Yeah.
brilliant people in that when they get it right. But the problem is that there's a lot of guys in there who are doing this almost like a social justice cause, and they're throwing
Mm.
100% of their money and they're losing it. If you follow the
Yeah.
Reddit subreddits, it's like they call it loss porn,
Yeah.
where they've
I've
lost
read those.
100% of their assets. That is insane.
Yeah.
There's craziness that we're glorifying people losing money. It's
Mm.
like scares the crap out of me. But anytime you're going into any growth industry at all, regardless of if I know about it or not, it needs to be a diminutive part, especially if you don't have a lot of time. Even if it's an
Hmm.
ETF, it should be a small part of one's overall holdings to ensure that a market change or a market problem doesn't create a problem for you, right?
Right.
It's the market's problem. It's not your problem. Um, because it's such a new industry, you don't know what could happen. Just like you were saying earlier, Brett, about how we got really close before and the government pulled
Right.
us back.
Yep.
That happens. The stocks are going to reflect a regulation shift like that. I'm not going to say
Right.
that's going to happen. I really think that on the pharmaceutical side, we've kind of hit it right this time.
Right.
But things could happen. Let's say, if one of the
We.
big companies out there is, found to do something very negative,
Right.
um, that's
That could
going
ripple
to,
through the entire industry.
that'll ripple through the entire industry and your entire ETF is going to get blown up.
Right.
But on the other side of things, let's say one of these other companies does something really great and actually makes a massive discovery as it relates to brain health. That's also
Mm.
going to ripple through your entire portfolio in the positive.
Right.
Everything has its place. What's the saying? Moderation, even moderation.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so so
Everything is fine in moderation.
yeah,
Yeah.
everything's good in moderation. So it's the
Yeah.
same thing with this. Is that especially if you don't have a lot of
Mm.
time. If you're not a
Yeah.
professional investor, you shouldn't be socking hundreds of millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars into something that you don't have a good understanding of. If you
Of
understand it,
course.
great.
Yeah.
And what I say to people is, if you're going to invest in an industry, even if you don't think you have the time, you have the time. You can make
Yeah.
the time, 100%. You may not be the expert in that industry, but you should just understand it to a level where you see at least the writing on the wall. When
Hmm.
I was 23 years old, 24 years old, that's when the iPhone started to be developed. That's when I had my first BlackBerry. And I looked
Right.
at the my iPod at the time, and I said, with my BlackBerry, I was like, well, if they can put these two things together, well,
They're
they've
the
really
same
got
thing.
something here.
Yeah, yeah. I had both for a while.
Yeah, exactly.
I
So did
remember
I.
having the iPod and my BlackBerry with a little click screen, and it was super frustrating to use. And I
I
think like
love BlackBerry.
iPhone was only on Rogers at the time, and I
That's
heard
right.
iPhone was being released to everyone, and I was like, "Holy shit, this is
This
pretty
is
cool."
happening. This is happening.
Yeah, yeah,
So yeah, so I had an understanding of the companies because I at least looked at the industry. I looked at what was going on with the industry. I looked at where people were interested in. Same with the psychedelic sector. Like I said, are you interested in a drug psychedelic? And if you are, great, but that's going to be 5 to 10 years out. That's the
right.
reality. A drug psychedelic that's going to be in your pocket, prescribed by your doctor, is 5 to 10 years away.
Mm,
Full stop. But if you're interested in potentially pursuing a trip
hmm.
where you actually go on a guided meditation, guided trip, that's available today. And that could be part of
Right.
your vacation plans. If that
Hmm.
makes sense to you and you would do something like that, then maybe you should look at a company that actually does that.
Right.
Or vice versa. If you are someone like myself who requires a certain amount of nutraceuticals or nootropics to help you get going for the day because of your ailments, and
Mm,
you don't want to go through the pharma side, you want to go through the functional mushroom side, and you believe in that side, why wouldn't you invest into a company that does functional mushrooms really, really well?
mm,
So from my standpoint is invest in what you feel comfortable with, that you are happy with the product that's being created. You've tried that
hmm.
product, or you've tried that service, or you've done something that makes sense to you. If you're looking for just that pharmaceutical side of things, that's fine, absolutely, but that is a speculative investment and should be seen as a speculative investment.
Mm. That's a great way to put it. Um, I like the philosophy too of just like invest in what you're passionate about. And you kind of said that, invest in what you're comfortable with, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're passionate about it, you want to continue to research it and learn about it as
Mm-hmm.
well,
Yeah.
which keeps you involved, which keeps you in the know. And if it aligns with your values, then that's just a huge bonus, and it makes you feel good about
Yeah.
what your money is doing out there in the world, right?
Yeah, you don't want to be in a place like where I call it envelope syndrome,
Hmm.
where your investment statement comes and it comes in an envelope and you just won't open the fucking envelope because you're terrified of what it says. You don't
Right.
want that,
Yeah.
okay? you
Yeah.
want you
Sell
want
those.
yeah, you
Yeah.
want to be able
Get
to
out.
go and look at it from the positive. You want to be like, this is cool. Whether this is going up or not, I'm involved in this. I'm excited about this.
Yeah, because I believe in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Awesome, man. I got one last thing before we wrap this up here.
Yeah.
In Canada, we're both in Canada right now. We have our federal election coming up.
Yeah.
Do you see any issues with who is going to be voted in, and then potential ramifications of, something maybe getting a pullback there?
It's so funny you ask that because like I've been kind of like waxing on this thought for so many weeks now. Like, is my
Right.
vote going to affect my career?
Right. No doubt. Yeah.
It's funny because I don't think so.
Mm,
Okay, so let's parse the two things. I understand that we're on a daily mushroom call, so I'm going to focus mostly on my mushroom side of things.
yeah.
But on the cannabis sector, no, cannabis is out of the bag. Like genie's
Cannabis is
out,
good.
it's
Yeah.
happening, it's
Yeah.
going, and the tax dollars are flowing.
Right.
There's no way in hell anyone's going to touch that shit. That is
Strong revenue.
gorgeous stuff. It's
Yeah.
growing like a perfect hockey stick curve for these government bodies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Loving it. They could fund schools now, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe some roads. Maybe the DVP will actually get paved. Anyways, but I digress.
Yeah.
On the mushroom side of things, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think it
Mm,
matters because it's staying so much in the pharmaceutical sector right now.
right.
There's even though we talk about it, there are advocates who are going to say, "Oh, this can be recreational. This can be recreational."
Yeah.
I don't see it.
It's gonna take a while.
It's going to be a hard lift.
Yeah.
It could happen. It could totally happen, but it's a hard lift. It is so different from cannabis. It is so different on the psychedelic side.
Yeah.
Functional mushrooms already out the bag, so there's nothing the government to do there. But I think on the pharmaceutical side, the data is so supportive. I don't think that they could put it back in the bag at this point. The data coming out is and again, I assume that some people are already thinking about this industry in a large fashion who are listeners to this podcast, but there may be people who are newbies. And what I will say, if you are a newbie, go check out the scientific data. It's crazy.
Yeah, go read some of those Hopkins and NYU studies, which we have a bunch of those in our newsletter that we continually bring out. So
it's incredible. Like the ketamine side of things, the 5-MeO side of things, the psilocybin sector, the MDMA, like ayahuasca.
Yeah.
They're finding that these things really do almost reset your brain to a way of thinking that you haven't probably used in many, many years. And sometimes you need that because we all live a life where we do the same things for 95 to 98% of the day that we did the day before.
Right.
You put your socks on the same way, you get dressed the same way, you look the same way for the general sense of things. And guys, like you have your haircut when you're like 25, you practically don't change it until you go bald. Okay, that's how it works.
Yeah.
So like having that little shift of mentality and how you see things. Like I want to give you guys an example, if you don't mind. Is that okay, Brett?
Of course, yeah.
You're in a relationship, and while you are, let's say, a very forward-looking person, very, we'll call it liberal person, you still have some legacy thoughts as your parents were. You know, man works, woman at home type of stuff. I'm not gonna say it's correct or wrong or anything like that. That's not my position today. I'm very progressive, but again, you're a listener. You have that in your head. You don't even know it. You don't even think about it. It's not something you ever address. And you do a psychedelic experience, and it's something that you're all of a sudden saying to yourself, "Shit, why do I even have that thought? Why does that even why does it even cross my brain? And why am I thinking in that light?" And there's 100 different connections that you do like that every day. Every day. That you have no idea that you've made an association, or you think of certain things, or you don't like someone because of a certain aspect about them, or you see yourself in other people and you don't even realize that you're seeing yourself in other people, and that's why you have issues with them. These are the things that the psychedelic actually tinkers with. That's what it fiddles with. And when you're sitting there after a psychedelic trip and you're like, "Oh, I didn't have my great epiphany," the great epiphany is actually that small stuff, that incremental stuff that changes how you act on your everyday life. That's what this is about.
Absolutely.
And that's crazy. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, and you won't necessarily realize it until a couple days or a week or 2 weeks later when you're doing that thing that's so deeply ingrained in your habitual day to day, and you might do it a different way, or you might question it for a second, and that's the power right there.
Yeah, like one of the things like I struggle with, again, because of this liver disease I have, is that I've convinced myself that I'm going to die young.
Right.
I've convinced myself because all the data associated with this liver disease suggests that I'm going to die young. Right? And I live my life like that.
Right. And the reason why you're so good at compiling data and research is because that's what you do for a living. So that's can go down.
I can go down a rabbit hole like nobody's built business.
Right.
I can find you. Anyway, but like, it's crazy to me because only when I started to do all this research on the scientific side, because again, I haven't done psychedelics since I was like 20 plus years old or 20 years old. I know this stuff because I've spoken to people who are using psychedelics, and instead of just listening with my ears and trying to take what I would take from it, I'm actually interested. I'm genuinely interested in what they have to say.
Right.
And because I find that to be power. That's a power dynamic that I've convinced myself of when I was about 25, 26, is that listening to people is power. Who you hang around with is power. And I want power. I want power. I want power. That is power to me. Intelligence, aggregation of relationships, that's all power to me.
Yeah.
So the example I can give you guys for myself in the psychedelics thing, one of the things that I personally want to deal with is my fear of failure and what that means. So for me, I go work out. I'm an avid biker. I cycle a lot, and I'll go for like 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours, and I'll be fine. But I'll go up a hill that's really, really steep, and the entire narrative in my mind during that steep climb is you're not going to be able to make it. You're not going to be able to make it. You're not going to be able to make it. You're not going to be able to make it. And if you think that that is just relating towards your biking, and you probably may have the same thing in your life or something, I can tell you it's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's fucking everywhere. And what I'm really interested in working on is that negative self-talk that I have all the time when it relates to something difficult.
Right.
You're not good enough. You're not strong enough. You're not this. You're not that. Those are core belief stuff that you can't fix by talking yourself into it. You need someone to work a little inception on you to change that core belief and pluck out that bad idea that you have about yourself.
Right. Shift your perspective on it.
Totally.
Love it.
Cool,
That's
dude.
great, man. Let's cap it off there. That was a beautiful way to end this. Thanks so much, Lenny. I can't wait to see what you guys continue to do in the psilocybin space and with Cannabis Manufacturers Guild.
Thanks, buddy.
And Rivet Advisory is the name of the company there, just for anybody listening in. And yeah, I can't wait to check in with you again soon and keep this fire going.
No, thanks so much, Brett. I really appreciate you having me.
Awesome, man. Okay, we'll talk soon.
Take care.